A ragged, skull-headed presence in the room reacted with derisive laughter as Tor spoke, the sound undercutting the guild master's dry amusement. The tone changed when someone arrived in obvious distress, insisting they were far from relaxed about the situation. Their urgency settled over the office like a shadow. Before Tor could smooth matters with another polite offer, a shrouded void figure loomed and cut to the point, acknowledging that the visitor wanted something and urging that, if there was business, it be concluded quickly, leaving the meeting taut and unresolved. Tor Vinland addressed the room with a practiced calm, saying the task he proposed was simple, as he produced a small, plainly wrapped packet for emphasis. He explained that the guild, nominally under the empire, had been neglected for some time and painted a bleak picture. Villagers fleeing to survive, the few left behind forced into unreasonable risks to protect their homes, and families living each day trembling in fear of monster attacks. His words cut through the office like a tally of failures, people simply waiting for death. The talking skeleton interjected with a bitter challenge to Tor's appeal, questioning purpose and resistance to the empire. A void black voice then intoned the blunt truth that inaction would ensure nothing changed. Tor closed the exchange with a rueful admission that their record was not one of innocent inaction, leaving the room charged and unresolved. Tor Vinland opened the meeting by producing a small, plainly wrapped packet and framing the task as straightforward, then outlined the grim state of affairs. The guild, nominally part of the empire, had been neglected for years, villagers were fleeing to survive, and those who remained faced unreasonable dangers guarding fragile homes. He described families who trembled each day, waiting for monster attacks and the slow certainty of death. The talking skeleton cut in with a bitter, skeptical challenge to Tor's appeal, questioning whether resistance or purpose remained. A void black tone then delivered a blunt truth: if they did nothing, nothing would change. Faced with that accusation and the empty consequences it implied, Tor conceded that their record could not be read as innocent inaction, leaving the room heavy with unresolved guilt and obligation. A cigarette hung from a man's mouth as he summed up their predicament. The grim reality was that they could not simply do nothing. The narration widened, noting how the empire's northern lands had been left to rot, villages abandoned, and other guilds retreating into sheltered strongholds, concentrating their strength to guard their own homesteads rather than the region. The talking skeleton challenged the room, asking whether anyone truly expected a league of guilds to rise against the empire, and Tor Vinland answered that such a course would be tantamount to declaring war, an outcome none were eager to accept. The skull argued the issue was not merely courage but a deeper failure. They had waited, desperate and hopeful, for an outside savior to appear and end their suffering. That weary expectation held until the final panel, when, from the edges of the meeting space, a woman appeared and abruptly altered the room's quiet resignation. After the unexpected woman had entered the meeting and paused the room, attention settled on the pale young figure titled the hero. The narrator recalled how that warm hope had risen them from despair and how they had believed, however faintly, that she might save them. For a moment they had clung to that fragile expectation. They then conceded the truth. The hope had been futile, and they asked where it had gone wrong, wondering if their attachments were to blame. Meeting the woman sharpened a darker realization. What they truly lacked was hatred. The speaker's features grew harder as they declared indifference to ruined towns or a lost tomorrow, and vowed to walk so far and strike so deep that they could kill their enemies. In the final beat, a shadowed silhouette with glowing red eyes framed that vow, and the narrator closed on the grim assertion that war was born of the kind of hate they had finally found. After the earlier intrusion and the speaker's hard vow, a small voice asked for a single favor. In response, Tor Vinland stepped forward and offered 2 adventurers who could depart at once, promising that in time they would marshal whatever the guild could spare to support the cause. A close-up showed a fanatic intensity, an eye burning violet as the speaker begged for any kind of vengeance, calling out that a demon or devil would do, and asking that everyone be allowed to join the war. The proclamation, "All of us, let us join your war," hung in the room, and then a hush followed. Finally, the pale, round-faced figure on the couch apologized, acknowledged culpability for destroying the guard, and accepted responsibility for neglecting the empire, framing the coming campaign as their collective obligation and the next step forward. After the earlier intrusion and Tor Vinland's pledge to spare two immediate adventurers, the conversation quieted and attention fell on a small, red object left on the table. Tor examined it closely and stammered in shock when he recognized the sigil, an obsolete ruby-rank adventurer's tag, explicitly issued during the Great War, a classification that no longer existed. The relic's weight made the room feel older. Tor's disbelief met the small cloaked figure on the floor, who calmly dismissed concern and identified itself as a tedious ghost from the past. With that strange, patient confession came a decisive acceptance. To honor the request, they would first travel to the continent's worst mountain range, where the snow never stopped. The revelation stitched past failure and present purpose together, turning the relic from curiosity into the first step on a perilous, relentless path northward. After Tor Vinland had agreed to honor the request, the group's intent sharpened into action. The cloaked child moved with sudden urgency, a skull mask riding the rush of their cloak, and announced that they would go to the northern mountains. The spoken resolve cut cleanly to a map that made the decision concrete. A dotted line and arrowed path from Chanton village pointed north, crossing open country toward the fortress-like teeth of the range, and terminating at a skull-marked location beside the Northern Adventurers Guild. The map bore a single caption, Benrira's travel route, naming the journey and turning an abstract pledge into a plotted course. The panels stitched the earlier revelation and the new plan together, shifting the moment from stunned recognition into a plotted, unavoidable trek toward the snowbound northern reaches. After the route north had been sealed by plan and map, the group pushed into the snowbound spine of the range and measured the cost of their new course. By the fifth day since leaving the village, Benrira crouched on a windswept ledge and peered through a brass monocular at the pale ridges, while the talking skeleton kept a silent vigil behind them. Their conversation confirmed the small triumph of speed earned by keeping to the mountain line. They had moved deliberately and secretly along the range, a practiced, careful haste intended to skirt Imperial patrols, and that careful motion had become a point of observation as much as progress. The skeleton remarked on their pace, folding the simple fact into the larger concern. Moving fast was necessary, but it also underscored how close the Empire's reach could be if they slipped from the ridgelines into the low country. Having kept to the mountain line, the group crested another wind-scoured ledge and looked down on a frozen encampment and a thread of figures moving through the pass. Armored men below barked questions, incredulous that anyone could have gotten ahead of them, while a small, dry voice suggested these were not a search party at all. Benrira stepped forward and named them as remnants who had survived from Ganston village, arguing they appeared to be returning toward the capital after raiding other settlements. A stitched inset of the route confirmed what they could see. Travel along the range, exposed and without winter gear, made isolation likely and explanations plausible. As eyes tracked a lower track that forked from their line, someone called to the guide for a reading of that path. Benrira hesitated, and the response trailed off into uncertainty, leaving the party to weigh whether those desperate travelers posed threat or opportunity. From their wind-scoured ledge, the party traded grim readings of the routes below, until the white-cloaked skeleton stepped forward and named both himself and a fallen figure in the distance, anchoring the conversation. He warned that the lower fork would pass small private houses and argued those dwellings would be easy prey for desperate men en route to the capital. He described looting as common among imperial knights and framed the province as having been ravaged since the new emperor's rise. Benrira listened as the assessment hardened into judgment. When the skeleton's voice dropped to a single lethal sentence, a cold promise to kill the raiders, Benrira's features flickered from calculation to disbelief, sweat and shock tightening his expression as the weight of the choice fell over the group. From the wind-scarred rim, the group watched a small figure below, and one voice cut through the cold. Someone off-panel stammered, "What did you just?" And the faces of two white-cloaked companions snapped to shock. Before they could process it, the ground erupted. An explosive impact sent a spray of rock and bodies tumbling over the edge, and scattered armored men cried out in bewilderment as they were knocked prostrate. A pair of knights peered into the dust and mist, asking if an enemy attack had come upon them, but the confusion stalled as the plume cleared. From the fallout, a hooded skeleton leaned forward, its skull marked by a stark violet sigil, and simply replied, "Yeah." The terse affirmation landed like a verdict. The moment closed with the party's assessment giving way to the sudden, violent reality they had just set in motion. They had gathered on the wind-scoured rim when one voice cut through the cold, and the calm snapped. Two white-cloaked figures stared down, uncertain, until an eruption of earth and bodies overturned the ledge and men were hurled to the ground. An armored leader cried that it was an enemy attack, and another, incredulous, barked a warning so fierce it sounded like a dual challenge, only to be met by a derisive reply that the target was already dead. Alarm calls rippled through the ranks. Watchers shouted of an intruder at the cliff's edge and fingers were pointed. This was the necromancer from Changton village. The accusation landed as a skull's eye flared violet, a single, hollow pupil promising unnatural force. In moments the mountaintop became a riot of motion. Armored figures were thrown forward and off the rim, summoned or struck down into the void, while the party's brief assessment of the threat collapsed beneath the violent reality they had unleashed. The ridge erupted again as a skull-masked figure launched forward, and a violet-bladed assault shattered the defenders' formation. Bodies and armor spun outward and tumbled across the snow-swept slope. Soldiers who had only moments before argued about treachery were tossed aside as the attackers' sweeping technique, announced in the air as a slaughtering strike, cleared a corridor of motion and sound. From the turmoil came a terrified cry for rescue, and atop a rearing mount the Sir Knight urged calm order. Hold the rear, surround and block, do not fall back. There was suddenly, impossibly, only one enemy. Men fanned and hesitated beneath the strange pressure of the strike, and the scene tightened to a single face emerging from purple light. The close-up showed eyes suffused with unnatural glow, hinting that the violent skill had been born of something beyond mere steel. The mountaintop fell between frenzy and command, as the survivors braced against a power that had felled many at once. A skull-masked assailant sprang into the air and unleashed a violet-bladed sweep that detonated through the defenders, hurling men and armor across the snow. The blow, announced in the air as a slaughtering strike, cleared a path through the formation, scattering bodies and flinging skulls and corpses in the wake of the technique's unnatural force. Amid the chaos, a frightened cry rose, and the Sir Knight, rearing atop his mount, barked orders to hold the rear, surround the threat and not fall back, trying to stitch his soldiers back into a line. Troops fanned and hesitated beneath the pressure of the sweep as they realized the impossible. Everything had come from a single attacker. The sequence tightened to a close-up as purple light pooled behind a face, eyes glowing with otherworldly fire, hinting that the strike was born of something beyond mere steel. A skull-masked assailant launched a violet arc that slammed into a mounted trooper and his horse, hurling them across the snow and widening the crater of chaos on the field. Sir Knight's attempt to hold the line fractured as men stumbled and armor clattered, while the lone attacker stood composed, weighing the carnage he had wrought. He murmured just one and then stalked forward as a blade pulsed with purple light. It drove a searing beam into a survivor's face with a taunting question about eyes being merely decorative. The wound and the words were not the end but the herald of a revelation. The attacker spun, and behind him, a writhing wall of pale, agonized faces swelled like a living chorus, their hollow mouths and vacant eyes suffused with the same violet energy. The battlefield tilted under the presence of that unnatural congregation, proving the assault came from something beyond ordinary steel and malice. A skull-masked figure stood amid a widening crater of ruin and let loose a violet arc that struck a mounted trooper and his horse, hurling them into the snow and shattering the front line. As men staggered and armor rang, the attacker advanced with a pulsing purple blade that seared a survivor's face like a deliberate taunt. Where the blade struck, the air itself thinned and bled violet light. The strike was only the prelude. The assailant spun, and a living wall of pale, agonized visages swelled behind him, their hollow mouths and empty eyes suffused with the same necrotic glow, filling the field with a chorus of suffering. The presence of that unnatural congregation warped the battle's balance and suggested forces beyond mere steel. From the ridge, two white-cloaked observers watched in silence until one broke it, saying the skill he'd shown at the Adventurers Guild had been only a fraction of his true power, and the pair regarded the scene with a mixture of calculation and unease. A jagged purple maw filled the first frame, and the field answered with a raw, inhuman roar as lithe, fanged figures sprang into the line. Those violet attackers latched onto armored men with brutal speed. A soldier's scream ripped through the snow as one trooper was thrown, and others were seized in a flurry of claws and teeth. Knights tried to fight free, a single warrior wrapping himself around an assailant, but the corpse-like assailants twisted and multiplied, turning grapples into locks as blades flashed impotently. Close to the chaos, a skull-faced presence leaned forward, and eyes hollow and glowing, finished a breathless thought. That thing is. The declaration was cut off by the swell of bodies as the undead horde surged, pressing the living into a shrinking ring. At the fringe, a small, ragged silhouette watched the tide of purple engulf the line. The scene snapped into sharper focus as a skull-faced rider reared atop a convulsing, purple beast and launched a howling charge. The rider's hollow voice declared the thing to be the ghost of Changton Village. Below them, the field still boiled with the violet, fanged attackers, and the undead horde pressing the living into a shrinking ring. A ragged silhouette that had watched the tide earlier remained a distant, tense witness. From the crest, two white-cloaked observers, the red-haired observer and the dark-haired observer, exchanged words, acknowledging that the battle's crest had passed and that it was time to go down. The purple mount's shaggy hooves struck snow as it closed among crushed bodies, and the rider loomed over the fray in a close-up that tied their proclamation to the rolling red-backed mass of combatants. The page ended on the pulsing rhythm of the undead surge, the sound and sight of bodies ebbing and sweeping the field. The charge continued its savage arc, as the purple, skull-headed creature flung itself forward with a bestial howl while bodies and snow flew underfoot. From amid the churn, the cloaked talking skeleton remained near the front, its empty sockets fixed on the approaching threat as a lone soldier planted his spear and met the beast head-on. The skull beast's maw erupted in a flash of violet flame and tooth. The soldier's attack staggered but did not stop the creature, which slammed and twisted through the defense, sending shock through the line. Close-ups tightened on the talking skeleton's hollow stare as the confrontation neared its apex, then on the small, tied pendant at the skeleton's throat, a quiet, readable detail against the violent blur, as the fight's sound and motion swept outward across the snowy field. After the chaotic charge and the flash of violet that tore through the frozen line, attention narrowed to the small pendant caught at the skeleton's throat, and then to the hand that produced it. The traveler stepped forward and, voice low, presented the charm as a token of apology and goodwill. The talking skeleton leaned in, eyes hollow yet attentive, as the man explained the bauble was a charm his daughter had made to wish adventurers a safe return. The skeleton accepted it with a quiet, grateful gesture, and the traveler asked that she be thanked. For a heartbeat, there was a fragile exchange of courtesy and suspicion born of the recent violence. Then the traveler's tone hardened with a private sorrow. His daughter had been killed by the Imperial Army 2 years ago. The revelation undercut the charm's hope, leaving the simple gift to carry both comfort and unbearable absence across the snow-streaked field. After the brief courtesy over the pendant and the traveler's confession of private loss, the conversation slid into something more communal. The traveler murmured an apology for his earlier careless words, and the group, roughened by wounds both visible and not, dismissed the need for apologies, as if bending a shape they all knew too well. Muscled hands shifted crates while a smaller face watched. Voices spoke of scars and the choice to burn a life on revenge. The traveler's tone hardened with a rueful smile as he cast his warning outward like advice from an older brother, urging them not to waste themselves on vengeance. The talking skeleton stood close, expression unreadable, as the man finished with an insistence that no one was truly alone, that everyone, even the damaged and the dead adjacent, had someone waiting for them. The moment held a fragile warmth beneath its somber honesty. A bloodied mouth, close and ragged against the cold, murmured a last warning, so. "Don't go too far, skeleton." The talking skeleton erupted with a raw howl and surged outward, flinging itself into the wind and snow across a frozen expanse where the sky tore in gusts. The landscape telescoped beneath its motion, a quick, violent passage that ended with the skeleton coming to ground and striding toward an armored figure standing alone on the ice. From a higher angle, the two closed the distance, the armored silhouette resolute and immobile. Without warning, a magenta-hued humanoid with a long staff revealed itself behind the armored man, planted and ready to strike. The sudden presence made the moment precarious and immediate. The camera tightened once more on the skeleton's hollow face as it paused, vulnerability replacing rage, and the small skull tilted to murmur, "I'm sorry." The winter air held the fragile confession like a held breath. A bloodied child in a hooded cloak tilted their face into a close shot and murmured a broken name and plea, "Michelle." Daddy then offered a small apology, voice raw against the cold. The talking skeleton paused nearby, shame and resolve crossing its hollow features, as the magenta-hued figure planted its long staff beside the fallen and prepared to strike. For a beat the scene held, a quiet that tasted like winter, before the magenta attacker cut the air with a searing, white arc. The blow met bone and cloth, and then the skeleton answered. It lashed out with a violent, physical counter that detonated into a purple, explosive impact. The magenta form was thrown back in a shower of gore and motion lines, collapsing onto the ice. Above that raw exchange, a towering hooded silhouette raised a clenched fist to the sky, and two white-cloaked observers at the edge of the frame offered a terse commendation. "Good work, Master Skeleton," leaving the tableau both triumphant and ominous. After the magenta-hued assault and the talking skeleton's explosive counterstrike had left the attacker broken on the ice, the two white-cloaked observers moved forward to assess the scene. The red-haired observer and the dark-haired observer confirmed the immediate danger was over, instructed others to rest, and offered to handle the cleanup, their voices calm against the cold sky. Flames licked into life as a funeral pyre was prepared, and one observer muttered, "What a strange man," while the other declared he did not need undead and asked whether they should cremate the fallen. A solitary, bald-cloaked figure remained apart from them, watching the blaze from the snow and uncertain of its purpose. He watched the fire consume the corpses and wondered aloud who the ritual served. The tableau held a quiet, somber closure, decisive violence followed by pragmatic rites, observed by those who had fought and by one who could not yet place the meaning behind the flames. Dark Man had held the small cloaked child close and remarked on the other's sad expression as the world beyond them erupted into a towering blaze. The camera of the moment pulled back to reveal a vast funeral pyre, its heat and light swallowing the horizon, while a disembodied voice rose from the flames to gloat. It claimed the man would be forced into countless choices and sink even deeper into despair, that his role was not yet finished. Dark Man cut the voice off with a terse, angry order to be silent, but the voice only continued, and a skeletal face emerged from shadow to sneer that the dead should stay quiet in the afterlife. Black-tinged shadows with violet eyes then answered with high, predatory laughter, and the exchange ended on a jagged, unresolved note as the flames roared and the threat still smoldered. The talking skeleton hovered in the smoke and spoke with a cold, taunting patience, urging anyone alive in that state to struggle and try to defy fate, while tendrils of black and violet hunger shifted behind it. It warned that at the end of every resistance, there would be a despair so absolute even it did not yet know how to greet it, and its words hung heavy as the camera pulled back to show a monstrous, dark sword and a vast funeral pyre swallowing the horizon. A lone silhouette, small against the inferno, stood beside a blade planted in the ash as the voice continued to mock any attempt to flee destiny. The view widened to reveal walls and a city reduced to smoke and flame, while figures moved like ghosts across the scorched plain. As a lone shape ran from the ruins, the sequence ended on a quiet, strange note, a single musical bubble drifting through the red sky, an odd punctuation to the skeleton's proclamation of inevitable despair. The talking skeleton's taunt lingered over a horizon of smoke and flame as the camera drew back from the funeral pyre and the scorched city. Against that ruined sky, a red-haired woman had perched on a high balcony and hummed as if to music. She leaned on the stone, savoring the scent and sound of burning below, letting her smile, all jagged teeth and mirth, cut through the inferno. Beside her stood a silent, plated figure, whom she addressed as Lord Frey, goading him with a casual cruelty. The men wanted to play a game with the princess's head. Would he permit it? She shrugged off the proposition, claiming to be heartbroken and bored by how the kingdom had ended so blandly, then spoke into the blaze for something wilder, anyone willing to pick a fight with the empire. Her mockery and appetite for spectacle hung over the ruined city, while Lord Frey remained a stoic, immobile presence at her shoulder. Smoke and ruin still smoldered beneath the balcony when an imperial herald bellowed up to the high ledge, unfurling a decree and announcing that a vast undead force had appeared at the northern wall and that the emperor commanded its destruction. The messenger's proclamation cut through the haze, formally calling for War Knight Frey to lead the effort to subjugate the necromancer behind the uprising. The red-haired observer listened with a grin, her jagged smile widening into mirth. She treated the formal summons like a joke, chuckling at the notion and calling the herald a madman for daring to expect obedience. At her side, the armored lord remained an immobile presence, but she needed no one's permission. She flicked a foot, dismissed the warning, and gave the single, cold order that turned mockery into threat: assemble the troops, as the ruined city waited for whatever spectacle she intended to make of the coming fight. After the herald's formal summons and her earlier dismissal, the red-haired observer moved from the ledge with deliberate steps, boots scuffing the broken stone as smoke curled around her. A dark procession waited in the haze behind her, hulking, faceless figures with red-lit visages that answered her like a drilled cohort, and she toyed with the moment before the strike, cooing lightly that they should go play. The flash of a greatsword and the widening of her fang-like grin transformed levity into menace. She announced, without hesitation, that they would go to war. The assembled force, equal parts monstrous and obedient, shifted as though responding to a single will, and the ruined streets below braced for the carnage she had chosen to unleash. They moved through a pale, wind-swept wasteland, two figures reduced to small shapes against the endless drift. The younger one spoke first, noting how quiet everything had become, and the white-cloaked woman with the red hood answered with measured remarks as another cloaked traveler watched from his furred mantle. Their footsteps left the only trace, and conversation turned inward, how an undead had been seen floating above the ruins of a place called Spear Tower Village, and how that apparition might connect to a recently deceased warrior. They compared knots of memory and rumor. The village shared the warrior's childhood name. He had once been carried by knights and fled there, and now those past movements seemed to overlap with a new, spreading undead presence. As the group crested a ridge, the ruined settlement came into view, mute evidence that past and present were converging on the same, cold ground. After cresting the ridge and taking in the ruined settlement, the party turned its attention to the strange figure they had encountered. The talking skeleton observed that the creature's fighting stance was identical to the warriors they knew, and the blonde girl confirmed the resemblance. The two white-cloaked observers, one red-haired and masked, the other with a dark ponytail, argued quietly about motive. It might not be malicious, perhaps desperate, but there was no certainty it would act as they desired. Weighing the risks, they proposed a cautious plan. Since the northern travelers knew the routes, the observers asked them to show the entity the way toward the empire. The red-haired observer warned that the creature's actions were unpredictable, while the talking skeleton offered a terse reassurance. The scene closed with an exchange of a rolled message to a blonde messenger, who accepted it with a smile and said he had a good feeling about the task. A hooded stranger had frozen at a sight, a single golden eye widening before he realized the direction of the threat. A solitary figure on a ridge then spoke, indicating the undead were that way and naming the Spirit Tower Village as a waypoint, adding that he would stop there for a while. The moment lingered, cold wind across empty snows, and the story then cut to a warmer scene as the journey continued into a bustling village. The blonde girl and her small sack-headed companion arrived beneath pennants and stone roofs, weaving through streets and past shop signs until they paused to celebrate the arrival with a playful pose. Their small companion tilted its head in curiosity, while the blonde girl beamed for the camera of the moment. A red-haired stallkeeper soon appeared among the stalls, meeting them with a surprised expression that closed the sequence on an ordinary, lively note after the earlier warning from the ridge. After leaving the chill of the ridge and slipping into the warmer bustle of the village, the blonde girl and the kid walked beneath pennants and around market stalls until they reached an open square where a public demonstration had gathered spectators. A mounted target stood at the center of the hall, and a marksman loosed an arrow that drove into the bullseye. The camera cut to a tight shot of the red and white rings pierced cleanly. The crowd's roar swelled, people leaning and shouting over one another as the pair cheered among them, the blonde girl smiling and the kid bobbing with an eager, simple joy beneath its paper sack. The red-haired stallkeeper watched from a stall nearby, surprised but pleased by the commotion, and the sequence ended on the kid's face close-up and a painted target emblem on a hanging sign, anchoring the scene in the village's festive energy. The camera moved away from the village's bustle into the quieter corners of the fairgrounds. A close shot lingered on the painted emblem of the target, before pulling back to show twin bullseyes propped against a weathered wall and the hollow expanse of the practice hall. The sequence then cut to the interior of a dim, wood-beamed inware in the gloom. A pair of bound hands nervously fumbled and found a metal ring in the floor. They hooked it and hauled, revealing a hidden opening. A skull-faced figure stepped forward, speaking with a dry, sardonic cadence, and apologizing that the inn had been closed a long time, then muttering a rueful aside about confusing cup times with totals. The skeleton's attention turned to a small, practical question about a fancy bread bag, as the final panel lingered outside on the cold cobbles, where a body lay supine and a small token rested nearby, the village's cheer giving way to a quiet, uneasy stillness. Inside the shadowed hall, the conversation tightened as the red-haired observer recognized someone and asked how they knew. The moment was small and intimate, answered only by the lifting of a tankard and the clink of ale. The talking skeleton answered with a rueful, low remark and produced a dark bottle, turning the talk toward a particular liquor and the peculiar customs tied to it, how adventurers once marked departures by sharing that drink. Around the table, the mood grew quieter as the skeleton explained the drink's place in their rites, and the observer admitted it had not been sold here in some time. A masked figure lingered on the absence behind the words. There were simply no more adventurers left in the village. The sequence closed with a lone cloaked person on the rooftops, looking down over empty streets and that hard, echoing truth. Continuing from the empty rooftops, a voice rose out of the ruined dusk to call the uprising misguided and to argue that what the child planned now was wrong. The talking skeleton spoke from the shadows and weighed the terrible possibility that, though the empire might yet be saved, it would not be in a way the child would have wanted. He insisted the child would not have wished to be remade into that dark shape. Then the skull produced a small cluster of pale triangular tokens on a table and noted, with a hollow tenderness, that someone had left them in his care. He said the unnamed person had asked him to pass the pieces on. The cloaked kid sat in silence as the meaning of the fragments settled over them, equal parts promise, burden, and question, while a blonde figure lingered at the edge of the exchange, as if threading the final link in a chain of requests. After the exchange of pale tokens and the hush on the ruined roofs, the scene moved inward to scattered maps and penciled notations that were carefully inspected. A grinning, pale-haired man pointed out a fragment that might yet be useful and asked for a record to be made. Memory bled into the present with a stopped frame of a ragtag band beneath a single, emphatic caption, "Adventure," before a close confession broke the montage. A tearful figure admitted she had wanted to leave with someone else. Silence answered in the cramped room. A bound hand and a gloved palm reached toward one another as the word adventure slipped out like a prayer. The skull then spoke again in low, earnest tones about the hunger for revenge and the strange perfection of pain and fire, confessing that, though everyone called him the kid's teacher, he learned just as much, inviting the child to put a heavy trust upon his shoulders. After the cramped confessions and maps, the scene shifted to a softer departure. The skeletal figure offered a small, grateful remark and rose from the table, prompting the blonde girl to ask where he was going now. The talking skeleton and the traveler exchanged a few rueful words about beginnings. The skeleton's gesture and the traveler's calm resolve suggested this was not a sudden flight, but a chosen step. Benrira said that, having had a drink, he should be on his way, and the blonde girl quietly admitted she had wanted to leave and see the road with him. Their choice was stated plainly. This would not be revenge, but an adventure shared together. The panels closed like a title card, the story of the skeleton messenger, and a map unfurled, marking Benrira's travel route as the world opened again to them. Benrira and the cloaked companion had a quiet exchange on a rooftop as they finalized travel plans. The companion asked if Benrira was done with his conversation and insisted they would take the normal route from here, while Benrira replied with reluctant agreement. The companion's manner flickered between casual and uneasy, and Benrira remarked that her vibe had changed, which prompted a close, worried look from the hooded figure. Below, a blond man approached and offered a rolled paper with an easy, flattering line about having a good eye for people. His tone suggested a civic or guildly role. Benrira listened as the man began to introduce our guild master, then turned to leave, prompting Benrira and the companion to call after him, a shouted plea to wait, as they rushed from the rooftops toward the road and the open landscape beyond. After Benrira and his cloaked companion hurried away from the rooftops, the page cut to a lone cloaked figure standing in the street, framed beneath the title. The narrative then turned didactic, laying out the adventurer hierarchy as a 10-rank pyramid and labeling the tiers, while noting that adventurers could not accept quests ranked above their own level. A diagram divided the field into upper, middle, and lower tiers and identified Topaz as the 7th rank. The text stressed that higher-ranked adventurers charged steep commission fees. The explanation made clear that ordinary people rarely rose beyond rank 7, and that those who managed to do so earned the epithet superhumans. The sequence closed on a hooded adventurer beneath the exposition, the words describing the intimidating wall of the higher tiers lingering like a warning about the gulf between common talent and true elite power. The exposition opened over a ridge as narration declared that, from the 8th rank onward, adventurers explored uncharted regions alone. The shot moved from the lonely watcher to a bloodied foot soldier as the text described the alternate path, becoming cannon fodder in massed lines against monsters. A white-cloaked, mounted figure was presented as the imperial option for higher tiers, then a hand set aside a hat as the voice moved to summarize. Low-tier work meant killing common beasts. The scene tightened on a lone, lower-tier fighter who stalked and cleaved through goblin attackers with blunt, efficient strikes. Just as the lesson concluded that one must be a lower tier to handle such foes, the ground-shaking reveal of an enormous golem-like giant rose beyond the tree line, turning a routine patrol into an immediate, overwhelming threat. A leaping fighter slammed a spear into the flank of an immense boar-like beast, driving the weapon home with primal force as gore and impact filled the frame. Narration noted that the people who killed such things were middle-tier adventurers. The sequence cut close to the wound and the attacker driving the blade, then pulled back to a hooded, masked observer who began to speak, broaching a final, grimmer category. A vast, blood-smeared blade hovered in a liminal panel as the tone shifted toward dread, and the view widened to reveal a shattered battlefield upon a ridge. 3 bodies lay, draped across the monstrous carcass, while a lone cloaked figure looked on. The observer concluded that, although the attackers had been middle tier, the 3 fallen must have been a higher tier, leaving the scene heavy with the implications of unequal force and a severe threat beyond ordinary ranks. A leaping fighter had driven a spear into an immense boar, and 3 bodies had been left draped across its carcass. The shattered ridge had settled into an uneasy quiet when a skull-headed interlocutor engaged the survivors. The talking skeleton confirmed the pair were listening, asked their ranks, and learned they were both 5th tier, Topaz, prompting him to remark on how the ranking system had changed since his adventuring days. When asked if he had once been an adventurer, the skeleton admitted to having held the rank Ruby and half-boasted of former prowess, drawing laughter and incredulous teasing from the red-hooded companion. The easy camaraderie snapped when a distant, taunting voice asked, "My undead army," and a streak of violet energy, blade-like and unnatural, bloomed into the sky. The spiky-haired youth whirled as the purple manifestation advanced, and the group's banter hardened into immediate alarm as the new threat closed in. A violet blade-like force loomed over the field and sent the spiky youth into a terrified scream as the group's banter fractured into panic. Small magenta creatures erupted from the disturbance. The red-hooded adventurer stepped forward, half playful, half pleading. She declared she could handle it and begged the summons to be put away. The creatures collapsed back into pink pillars and dispersed amid a begrudging, breathless truce. The talking skeleton observed the aftermath with blunt amusement, remarking on the northerner's surprising grit, and the moment softened into a recollection. For a beat, the chaos felt like the ragged pride of a band of middle-tier adventurers. The montage of weary companions gave way to a quiet aftermath on the ruined plain, where talking skeleton and blonde girl sat facing each other in the settling dust. She flashed a fierce, intimate grin, leaving the field calm but charged with the echoes of what had just happened. After the dust settled on the ruined plain, the small skull-faced companion fell into explanation, remembering how the foothills teemed with monsters and how the place had already become a veritable park for wayward horrors. He detailed promises and plans he had made, then paused as a grinning, wild-bearded man intruded on the memory and drew a puzzled reaction. The companion corrected that what guarded those lines was not simply a wall. It had been crafted by a wizard from the old hero party, specifically to stop undead waves, and it stood on the front lines of the Demon King's domain with phenomenal, anomalous power. From the battlements, a cloaked, hooded woman listened, and with a sharp, deliberate smile, suggested she could exploit that very defense to further a larger scheme against the Empire. The notion hung in the air, equal parts opportunity and threat. After the earlier talk about the wizard-forged defenses and the cloaked woman's opportunistic suggestion, the skull-faced companion spoke plainly from the hilltop. He intended to make the northern peoples his allies. The hooded, red-cloaked adventurer and the spiky-haired youth exchanged pointed questions and wary remarks, probing what that alliance would mean and whether it could actually strengthen their position. Reclining, the skeleton admitted his original aim had been far harsher, an attempt on the emperor, but said a disciple had dissuaded him. For now, he preferred rebuilding the empire properly rather than reveling in slaughter. He then tried to lighten the mood when the confession grew heavy, but the red-hooded challenger cut in with a stinging accusation, reminding them that these were the same people who had failed the so-called Great Hunt and fled, an implication that cast doubt on the group's competence and motives.